They never told you that the most dangerous place in the Tudor court wasn't the throne room. It was the bed. Behind silk curtains, marriages became traps. Witnesses hid in the dark, and a single breath could crown a queen or destroy her before dawn. Secrets clung to the sheets tighter than lovers ever could. Tonight, you will walk into the chambers where power whispers louder than prayers. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment, letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to stand at the threshold of a Tudor bridal chamber, the silence alone would tell more truth than the vows spoken downstairs. The room looked warm, almost tender in the glow of candlelight. Yet every soft curtain and polished bedpost hid a weight far heavier than affection. People like to imagine that royal marriages were woven from romance or divine blessing. But inside these walls, the air carried something colder. A quiet understanding that a woman's entire future hung on what happened, or did not happen, between two bodies on a single bed. In the Tudor court, marriage was never about the solace of companionship. It was strategy disguised as a ceremony. A political blade wrapped neatly in silk sheets. The bridal bed was always prepared with a strange kind of reverence, as though it were an altar. Servants smoothed the linen until not a crease remained, and courtiers lingered with the smug satisfaction of people who understood exactly what that bed was meant to confirm. For them, the night was not private. It was a transaction waiting for evidence. A queen could be celebrated in daylight, but she would not be secure until darkness proved her usefulness. The tension clung to her skin long before the candles were dimmed. She knew that the bed held her life more tightly than the crown held the king's. No one said it aloud. Yet everyone knew that a single failed night could unmake a marriage faster than any papal decree. A bride might smile at the feast, drink from silver cups, dance to flutes and drums, but she also felt the weight of eyes measuring her steps, wondering whether she would bleed by dawn. Every woman who married into power had to swallow the same bitter truth. Love was irrelevant. Skill was irrelevant. And even beauty meant nothing. What mattered was obedience to a ritual that treated her body not as flesh, but as proof. People outside the palace imagined royal bedding as something delicate or privileged. But the truth was far from gentle. The court moved with a rehearsed choreography, guiding the couple toward the room where everyone else's ambitions were folded into the mattress. Behind every gesture there was suspicion, behind every blessing. Recalculation. Courtiers hovered like moths near a flame, waiting for the heat of gossip to ignite. A single whisper. Too quiet. Too early. Too sharp. Could ruin a woman before the door even closed. Inside the chamber, the pressure settled like smoke. It was difficult to breathe under the weight of expectations written by men who would never feel their consequences. Even the king, for all his authority, felt the invisible demands that pressed against him. He knew the court counted on him to fulfill his duty, not for pleasure, but for lineage. A consummated marriage strengthened alliances. An unconsummated one could be dissolved overnight. And so the bed became a battlefield where neither sword nor shield could help. Only performance. For the bride, fear rarely showed on her face, because fear itself was a risk. A trembling hand could be mistaken for guilt. A hesitant breath could be twisted into an accusation. She had to walk into the room with calm resignation, though she understood perfectly the cruelty of what awaited her. The chamber was warm, but her skin felt cold, as if the night had already decided the verdict, and she was merely acting out the ritual. The sheets were white, impossibly white, as though chosen to reflect her failure at the world if her body did not cooperate. The idea that a bed could determine a destiny seems absurd. Yet, In the Tudor court, it was accepted with unsettling ease. People bowed to the Queen in the morning, then dissected her most intimate moments by afternoon. They spoke of her inferences, speculated about her cries or her silence, reduced her existence to whether she was penetrated or not. The court's hunger for certainty devoured her dignity. Meanwhile, the king remained untouched by the same scrutiny. His body was not evidence, hers was. This double standard was not questioned. It was the architecture of the era, built on the belief that a wife existed to anchor political alliances. If she could not provide an heir, she became a miscalculated investment, a pawn to be removed without ceremony. It is chilling to imagine how many women entered that chamber with hope, only to emerge with nothing but the certainty that their lives no longer belonged to them. The Tudor court knew how to cloak cruelty in velvet. The strangest part is how ordinary all of this seemed to everyone involved. No one gasped at the injustice. No one flinched at the humiliation. Advisors, en noble, and servants simply accepted that a woman's worth began and ended in the bed. They watched queens rise and fall with the quiet indifference of people observing the weather. The bed was both throne and trap, a place where triumph could bloom in an instant or wilt without explanation. Some women entered it believing they were loved. Others entered knowing they were already doomed. Yet all of them learned that Tudor power was not held in the halls or the courts, but beneath the canopy of a bridal bed, the illusion of ceremony, the lace and ribbons, the musicians and prayers. None of these softened the reality. The marriage bed was a mechanism, built to serve ambitions larger than any heart could bear. And although the night belonged to two people, the consequences belonged to the entire kingdom. In truth, that room was the first cage every Tudor queen stepped into, whether willingly or not. In the end, the chamber revealed how little choice a woman truly had. Somewhere beyond the door, other rituals were already waiting in the dark, and in one of them, a single stained sheet might decide who lives and who disappears. Royal marriage in the Tudor court never began with affection. It began with arithmetic. Every match was measured in borders, treaties, dowries, and the invisible weight of family ambition. A queen's smile meant far less than her lineage, and her beauty, her wit, her youth, all of it dissolved beneath the cold calculations of men who would never share her bed. The king did not choose a wife to ease his loneliness, but to strengthen the architecture of his rule. And behind him, whispering through corridors thick with incense and intrigue, the bride's family pushed forward their own quiet hunger. The idea of love had no place at these tables. Negotiations happened long before the bride ever stepped into the palace. Between fathers, uncles, advisors, and courtiers who knew exactly how much power could be gained by placing a young woman beneath a royal canopy. She became a symbol long before she became a wife, a promise wrapped in silk and escorted by diplomats. What she felt mattered so little that the court sometimes forgot she had feelings at all. Her tears were irrelevant. Her heritage was everything. Families who secured a royal marriage wore pride like armor. They imagined the elevation of their names, the strengthening of their influence, the slow but inevitable spread of their roots into the very foundation of the court. Yet they also knew the danger of such proximity to the throne. Every advantage came tied to expectation, suspicion, and risk. A daughter who failed to please the king could drag an entire family into disgrace. A daughter who succeeded might become the most valuable and most fragile piece on the board. Either way, she was a bargaining tool, slipped into a velvet-lined trap. The king himself moved through these arrangements with a detachment that appeared almost serene. For him, the marriage existed on parchment long before it existed in flesh. His counselors presented alliances like calculations, each bride reduced to a list of benefits and uncertainties. A princess from the north might bring soldiers, one from the continent might bring peace. Love was a luxury he was not expected to want, much less pursue. What mattered was securing a union that made the kingdom harder to challenge, harder to fracture, harder to topple. Yet beneath the surface, each marriage invited new unrest. When a foreign bride entered the court, she brought the weight of her homeland's politics with her. Nobles watched the king's affections with measured breaths, because any sign of favour could tip the balance of internal power. Courtiers aligned themselves with the queen's household or avoided it entirely, depending on whether her family's ambitions threatened their own. Every bow, every feast, every whispered greeting held consequences that stretched far beyond polite gesture. The queen herself bore those consequences silently. She knew she was expected to act with grace, humility, and unwavering devotion, even if she barely spoke the king's language. Behind closed doors, she carried the burden of representing her entire bloodline, a responsibility so heavy her ribs felt tight beneath her bodice. When she walked through the palace, she felt the eyes of factions studying her, assessing her usefulness, her temperament, her fitness to produce an heir. Her body belonged to the kingdom more than it belonged to her. The court understood that each marriage reshaped alliances like a shift in the wind. A queen from a powerful house could strengthen the king's legitimacy, but she could also threaten the influence of rival clans. A queen from a weaker house offered stability but little leverage. Either choice created enemies. For courtiers, the wedding was only the beginning. The real battles unfolded afterward, as factions maneuvered to position themselves closest to the queen's ear or farthest from her shadow. The most unsettling part of this system was how ordinary it all seemed. People accepted it as natural that women were exchanged like diplomatic currency. Sisters were raised knowing that their futures might depend on the ambitions of men they barely knew. Mothers taught their daughters to hide fear behind polite smiles, to play the role of the peace offering, the alliance, the living contract. In the Tudor world, marriage was not a sanctuary. It was a negotiation signed in silence and lived out in the dimness of royal chambers. Even the celebrations masked an undercurrent of dread. The music at a royal wedding sounded triumphant, but anyone with sense understood the truth. The bride's family was gambling everything, and the king was securing a tool. Flowers could not disguise that a life was being reshaped into obligation. Laughter could not obscure that, once the vows were spoken. Retreat was impossible. The court clapped and cheered because tradition demanded it, not because there was joy. A single misstep, a poorly timed word, a hesitation, a rumoured slight, could unravel the entire arrangement. And everyone knew it. That knowledge hung in the air like the faint chill that settles before a storm. Families arrived hoping for favour, praying for stability, but understanding that power never offered itself without a cost. The marriage bond that linked two houses was far more fragile than the silver rings exchanged before the altar. It could fracture under pressure, splinter under suspicion, or be severed with ruthless efficiency if the king found greater profit elsewhere. And so, two-royal marriage remained a paradox, a union celebrated by thousands, yet shaped entirely by the quiet ambitions of a few. It offered prestige but demanded obedience. It promised elevation but risked ruin. Everyone involved smiled for the sake of appearances, though each knew the truth, that this was not love, but a strategy bound in lace. In the end, the union revealed how much power could masquerade as devotion. Beyond the feasts and blessings, another choice waited in shadow, shaping loyalties no one dared to name. And somewhere in that shifting landscape, a single expectation would tighten around the bridal bed like a closing hand. The bridal chamber in the Tudor court carried a weight that was almost impossible to speak aloud. It was the only room where a queen's future could be decided not by counsel, not by lineage, not by loyalty, but by the silent unfolding of a single night. Everything the court expected from her, Everything her family had hoped for, everything she herself feared, converged beneath the canopy of that bed. The ceremony earlier in the day might have crowned her with flowers, but the marriage was not considered real until her body proved it. Legitimacy, influence, and status all hung on the fragile thread of consummation. The unsettling truth was that a queen was recognized only after the act was completed. Before that moment, she was merely a bride in expensive fabric, a woman occupying a temporary space. Once the chamber doors closed, she ceased to be a symbol and became an object of scrutiny. Her body, her reaction, her silence, her breath, all of it would be interpreted, debated, and judged. It was not affection the court wanted from the bridal bed. It was evidence. Without it, the crown on her head felt as hollow as the title she carried. The presence of witnesses, though discreet, was woven into the ritual. Servants prepared the bed. Courtiers observed the procession. And sometimes, behind the veil of ceremony, a designated attendant lingered just long enough to confirm that the ritual had begun. They would not watch the act itself, but they would stay close enough to hear, to interpret, to ensure that nothing remained ambiguous. Such a practice sounds grotesque now, but in the Tudor world, it was considered a safeguard, a boundary meant to protect political interests, not personal dignity. And then there was the matter of the sheet, a thin stretch of linen, meticulously chosen for its pale colour, became the final judge of a queen's worth. A few drops of blood could elevate her to unquestioned legitimacy. The absence of them could shatter her standing in a single morning. No one admitted how absurd it was to rely on such a symbol, yet everyone allowed it to determine a woman's entire destiny. The sheet was not just cloth, it was a verdict. If the consummation failed, the consequences were immediate and merciless. The court would sense the tension before sunrise. Whispers spread through corridors before the couple even emerged. Advisors exchanged glances heavy with implication. Families held their breath, knowing the slightest hint of failure might unravel the alliance they had risked everything to secure. A queen who could not produce evidence of consummation became vulnerable to every rumour, every accusation, every political manoeuvre designed to remove her. The king, of course, was insulated from blame. If something went wrong, the fault drifted toward the queen like smoke seeking the weakest point. Her body was expected to comply perfectly, regardless of fear, exhaustion, or the unfamiliarity of the moment. The king's hesitations, doubts, or private disinterest were ignored. The burden belonged entirely to her. A single night could define her as fertile, pure, obedient, or it could transform her into a liability. It is unsettling to imagine how she must have felt, lying beneath the canopy, aware that failure was not merely personal, but political. A tremor in her hands might be interpreted as reluctance. A sigh might be woven into speculation. The vulnerability of the moment became a weapon wielded by those who stood to gain from her downfall. The court waited with a hunger that bordered on cruelty, ready to twist the most intimate aspect of her life into public ammunition. Even after the act, the scrutiny did not stop. Servants collected the sheet as though handling sacred relics. Courtiers pretended not to care, though their eyes gleamed with anticipation. The queen emerged, knowing that her body had become a public document, submitted for approval. Her smile had to be measured, her steps steady, her voice calm. Any sign of discomfort could be taken as evidence of deceit. The cruel paradox was that consummation, once achieved, did not guarantee her safety. It merely granted her entry into the next stage of expectation. Now she was required to produce an heir, endure the king's whims, and navigate the ambitions of those who sought to use her new status for their own purposes. Yet without consummation, she was nothing at all. The bridal bed decided whether she would stand beside the king or be dismissed as a failed investment. For the court, this system made perfect sense. They believed that order depended on ritual, and ritual depended on proof. It never occurred to them that such proof was a violation. The intimacy of marriage became a spectacle, concealed only by thin walls and polite silence. The queen's body was no longer hers. It was a map of alliances, a ledger of debts, a testament to promises she had never chosen to make. Standing in that chamber after everyone had left, the air still heavy with expectation, a queen might have looked around and realized that the bed was not a place of union but a place of judgment. She had crossed a threshold from which she could never return. What happened in that room echoed through councils, treaties, and bloodlines. It was a ritual designed not to bind two people together, but to trap them in obligations that neither could escape. In the end, the bed determined a woman's place more sharply than any decree written in ink. Beyond its canopy, other rituals waited, each one hungering for proof of loyalty and flesh. Somewhere deeper in the palace, a quieter test stirred, ready to strip away whatever innocence remained. Failure, when it came from a king, was never truly failure. In the Tudor court, even the most intimate shortcomings could be reshaped into instruments of power, sharpened quietly and wielded without a trace of shame. A marriage that did not suit the king's shifting desires, an alliance that no longer served its purpose, a bride who suddenly felt inconvenient. All of these could be undone with a single whispered claim that the marriage had never been made real. Consummation was the hinge upon which a queen's fate turned, and the king alone could decide whether the hinge had moved at all. A king who wished to escape a marriage needed no storm, no betrayal, no confession. He simply needed to declare that his body refused to obey him. The court would murmur, the clergy would frown, but in the end, the burden of proof always slid, quietly and inevitably, toward the woman. Men in power were never questioned as harshly as those they bound to themselves. If the king claimed inadequacy, the assumption was never that he struggled. It was that she had caused the struggle. This tactic was used with a subtlety that bordered on cruelty. A king could step into the bridal chamber with every intention of leaving it unfulfilled. He might speak gently, reassuringly, as though he regretted the situation. He might even perform fragments of affection to maintain the illusion. But the queen would see it in the stillness of his hands, the distance in his eyes, the way he held himself apart, even in the darkness, meant to bring them together. She would recognize, perhaps too late, that the failure was not an accident, but a strategy. And once he stepped out of the chamber, the narrative would begin to reshape itself. Advisors and courtiers would gather in clusters, their voices low, their expressions carefully composed. They would not dare accuse the king of deceit. Yet each of them understood his convenience. Rumours would thicken like fog. The queen had been cold. The queen had resisted. The queen had carried some private flaw that made her unworthy of the royal embrace. No one needed to confirm these claims. The mere possibility was enough to fracture her standing. The queen, meanwhile, faced a torment she could not voice. To speak out would seem desperate, improper, even treasonous. To remain silent allowed lies to settle into the cracks of her reputation. She remembered every moment of that night, every glance, every breath, every hesitation. But she could not use any of it as defense. The king's word outweighed her truth, and the court preferred a story that preserved his dignity over one that protected hers. History records more than one such humiliation. In certain cases, the king's supposed inadequacy became the centerpiece of public inquiry. Council members questioned servants, examined the bridal bed, and demanded reports of behavior with a fascination that bordered on voyeurism. The king's body was discussed as though it were a relic, fragile and misunderstood, while the queen's became an object of suspicion. Trials unfolded with cold precision, reducing private pain into spectacle. It was not justice, it was theatre. The cruelty lay in the inversion of blame. The king's performance, or deliberate lack thereof, became the queen's failing. She bore the weight of an act she had no control over. If she protested, she appeared desperate. If she accepted the accusation, she condemned herself. Her body became the stage upon which her enemies built arguments, twisting intimacy into evidence. The king remained serene, untouched by scandal, even praised for his honesty in confessing his supposed shortcomings. A queen discarded in this manner faced a bleak horizon. Once declared not truly married, she lost more than status. She lost security, influence, and sometimes even the protection of her own family. The alliance that had brought her to the court collapsed instantly, leaving her stranded in a world that no longer recognized her place. She could be set aside quietly or exiled publicly, depending on how much the king wished to distance himself from her. Her life, once woven into the fabric of royal power, unraveled with shocking ease. The court understood all of this, and yet no one intervened. They accepted the king's word as final, trusted his motivations, even when they reeked of convenience. Whispered doubts flickered behind closed doors, but never grew into challenges. Too much depended on the king's favour. Livelihoods, titles, fanned futures. To question him, even privately, was to risk becoming collateral in the same machinery that crushed queens. What made this ritual of failure so chilling was its normalcy. People spoke of such cases as though discussing the weather, unfortunate, predictable, and beyond anyone's control. They shrugged at the injustice because it had always been this way. A king's desire, or absence of it, stood above scrutiny. A queen's survival depended on forces she could neither predict nor influence, and an entire realm watched these cruelties unfold with the same cold curiosity reserved for distant storms. In that world, to be married to a king was to walk a narrow path where affection meant little and vulnerability meant everything. The king's body, whether active or idle, could dictate the rise or ruin of a woman who had done nothing wrong. Failure, when crafted by his hand, became the sharpest weapon he possessed. In the end, a king's refusal held more power than a queen's devotion ever could. Beyond the chamber doors, other schemes stirred, each built on silence and carefully shaped truth. Deep within the palace, a quieter cruelty waited to claim its next witness. In the Tudor Court, nothing was as sacred or as terrifying as the bridal sheet, pure white when it was laid out. It waited like a silent judge, ready to determine whether a queen would rise or vanish. The court insisted the ritual was holy, almost divine, but the truth was far more brutal. The sheet existed to expose a woman, to reduce everything she was into a single mark. A drop of blood could secure her future. The absence of it could erase her. No prayer, no affection, no charm could replace what that thin stain represented to a world ruled by men. The expectation itself was a kind of violence. A queen entered the bedchamber knowing she was not only expected to offer her body but also required to bleed for it. Her flesh had to confirm her purity, her usefulness, her legitimacy, all in one night. The court watched her with a hunger that had nothing to do with admiration. They wanted proof, and they wanted it immediately. The moment the couple disappeared behind the heavy curtains, the whispers began to thicken through the corridors like smoke seeking cracks in the stone. By dawn, the sheet became more than fabric. It became a proclamation. If stained, it was lifted before select witnesses, handled with an almost morbid reverence. Every eye searched for confirmation, and those who saw it carried the news through the palace as though it were scripture. Celebrations unfolded with a strange urgency. Musicians summoned, Wine poured. Alliances reaffirmed. A queen who bled was a queen who belonged. But if the sheet remained white, it became a weapon. Silence fell differently on those mornings. Servants moved cautiously. Advisors exchanged looks that revealed far more than words. And the queen herself sensed the shift, the subtle withdrawal of warmth, the sudden calculation in every glance. Her body had betrayed her. They said, or worse, she had betrayed the kingdom by not matching the court's expectations. The bed had spoken, and she could not argue with its verdict. The cruelest truth was that the presence or absence of blood meant nothing factual. The court ignored that some women did not bleed, that nerves, fear, or the king's own failings could affect the night. Instead, they clung to a myth that served their ambitions. They needed a clear, physical sign they could measure, manipulate, and weaponize. In a world obsessed with control, the sheet offered a simple narrative, and simple narratives were easy to twist. Some families understood the danger and prepared accordingly. There were whispered stories of women coached on how to provide proof, even when nature refused. A small cut hidden beneath the folds of cloth, a vial of animal blood, a carefully staged marking. These were secrets passed from mother to daughter in hushed voices. To survive the court, they said, one must never rely on chance. Purity had become something that could be fabricated when necessary. This deception was not born of malice, but of fear. A queen who failed her first night could be cast aside like a broken promise. Her family would lose their standing, their influence, their carefully built alliances. They might face accusations, humiliation, or even exile. And so they did what they believed they must. They created the illusion the court wanted to see. It was not integrity the palace valued. It was conformity to a story that kept the hierarchy intact. The king, of course, benefited from this imbalance. A stained sheet confirmed his potency, enhanced his authority, and strengthened his claim to future heirs. A spotless one gave him the perfect excuse to dissolve a marriage that no longer served him. In either case, the woman shouldered the consequences. Her future dangled between two extremes, elevation or ruin. The court pretended that this system was just, but beneath the pretense lay a stark truth. The sheet existed to protect the king, not the queen. As for the queen herself, the moment the chamber door closed behind her, she stepped into a trial far more invasive than any courtroom proceeding. She had no advocate, no defense, no voice. She faced only the cold expectancy of a realm that believed a woman's worth could be pressed into cloth. In the dim light of morning, when servants approached the bed, she held her breath, knowing that her life might already be out of her hands. It is haunting to imagine a young queen sitting on the edge of that bed, listening to distant bells, while her fate hung on a string she could neither predict nor ensure. The palace outside might have looked magnificent, but inside that room, she knew how fragile her place truly was. The sheet lay folded nearby, innocent in appearance, merciless in purpose. For the court, this was normal. For the queen, it was a quiet brutality wrapped in ceremony. In the end, a single mark on linen carried more authority than a lifetime of virtue. Beyond the morning celebrations or silences, other trials waited, each crafted to test a woman's worth in the eyes of power. Far within the palace's shadowed halls, another judgment prepared to unfold without mercy. Virginity, in the Tudor world, was never a private matter. It was a commodity, a guarantee, a public certificate disguised as a bodily state. Families who offered their daughters to the crown understood this all too well. Before a marriage was even agreed upon, they were expected to provide assurances, spoken, written, sometimes sworn before witnesses, that the young woman was untouched. Such promises were treated with more gravity than financial contracts or political treaties. A king could forgive a rival nation. He could not forgive a bride who failed to meet the expectations forced upon her. These assurances were not poetic declarations. They were legal instruments, binding and chilling in their precision. A father might stand before the king's advisers and swear on his honour, his estate, and the future of his line, that his daughter's body bore no history but her own. The girl herself had no voice in this exchange. She was never asked, never consulted, never permitted to shape the narrative that defined her value. Her silence was assumed to be proof enough. But the Tudor court distrusted silence. It required verification. Thus emerged the most unsettling custom, the examination, performed unofficially by older women within the Queen's household or, in certain cases, demanded by the King's own advisers. It reduced a bride to a subject of inspection. The room chosen for this task was always quiet, shielded from direct view. Yet it carried an atmosphere of cold authority. The women conducting the ritual spoke softly, almost gently, as though compassion could soften the humiliation. Still, nothing could disguise what was happening. A young woman's body turned into evidence. The king, of course, remained distant from this step. His advisers carried out the process in his name, keeping his dignity intact while exposing hers. They reported their findings in tones that mimicked medical certainty, though their knowledge rarely extended beyond superstition. Their conclusions were influenced by political convenience, whispered alliances, and the shifting favour of the moment. What they declared became true, even when truth had no place in the room. A bride who passed the examination gained no real advantage, only permission to proceed into a marriage that demanded still more proof from her. A bride who failed, however, met consequences swift and merciless, a stain on her reputation, even without foundation, spread rapidly through the palace. Courtiers treated suspicion like blood in the water. They circled, whispered, speculated. Families who had once praised her beauty or lineage withdrew their smiles. To be accused was to be condemned. Scandal in the Tudor court did not erupt loudly. It seeped through walls. Servants felt it first. Then attendants. Then noble households who studied the king's expression for signs of displeasure. A queen-to-be could find herself transformed overnight into a liability. Negotiations might halt. Gifts sent in advance of the wedding might be returned. The king himself could distance his gaze, treating her with an indifference sharper than open hostility. Once doubt took root, it grew with frightening speed. None of this was based on science or reason. It was theatre crafted to reinforce control. Virginity, for the court, symbolized not purity, but possession. A bride was valuable only if she came untouched, unclaimed, unmarked by anyone except the king. If her body bore even the faintest suggestion of a past, or if someone chose to say it did, her political worth collapsed. The court demanded perfection, not because it believed in it, but because the ideal itself was a tool. A woman who lived under such scrutiny had no space left for fear. Fear itself became a constant companion. Some brides entered the palace already shaking beneath the weight of expectations. Others arrived cloaked in confidence, only to learn how fragile that confidence truly was. A single rumour could unmake her. A single jealous rival could plant doubt. A single advisor could twist a harmless detail into a scandal. The walls of the Tudor court were not built to protect its women. They were built to amplify every whisper against them. And yet the ritual persisted, upheld by tradition and power. Families complied out of desperation to secure royal favour. Advisors enforced it to maintain political leverage. The king accepted it without question, because the burden never fell on him. Only the bride bore the cost of a system designed to test her value before she had even spoken her vows. It is haunting to imagine a young woman sitting alone after such an examination, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting to learn whether she had passed a test she never consented to. The palace around her shimmered with luxury. But she understood that grandeur meant nothing. Her fate balanced precariously on the opinions of strangers who saw her not as a person, but as a requirement. Virginity, in this world, was not innocence. It was an obligation. It was surveillance. It was a blade held to a woman's throat, disguised as tradition. In the end, a body turned into evidence left no room for truth or dignity. Beyond the rituals of inspection, other demands gathered, each ready to tighten its grip on a woman's life. Within the palace's shifting loyalties, the next ordeal waited with a patience colder than stone. In the Tudor Court, an unconsummated marriage was not a marriage paused, it was a marriage weaponized. The delay, though cloaked in polite excuses and ceremonial restraint, carried a weight that could fracture alliances and unsettle even the most confident families. A king who hesitated did so with precision. His refusal to complete the union was rarely born of doubt or shyness. It was a calculated silence, a suspension of certainty that allowed him to test the air around him and measure the loyalties shifting beneath his throne. A queen who found herself in such a marriage stepped into a peculiar limbo. She bore the title, the jewels, the public reverence, yet none of it anchored her. She could not claim her place as wife, nor could she retreat to the identity she had before. She hovered in a fragile space where every gesture she made, every smile, every step, every fold of her gown, was interpreted through a single question. Whispered behind tapestries, why has the king not come to her? The palace, with all its grandeur, echoed with speculation. Politicians and courtiers understood the implications instantly. A delayed consummation meant the alliance was still negotiable. It meant the king could withdraw without scandal, claim uncertainty, or demand new concessions from the bride's family. It meant the marriage existed in name, but not in law, hovering like a shadow that could vanish at the king's convenience. Those closest to power watched him with sharpened senses, hoping to detect whether his hesitation was temporary or strategic. The queen's family, often far from court, yet painfully aware of its games, could do little but wait. Their letters arrived heavy with worry, urging patience while cloaking their fear in formal phrases. They knew that an unconsummated marriage floated dangerously close to collapse. For them, each passing day without resolution felt like watching a priceless relic suspended by a fraying thread. They had gambled their daughter in hopes of security and influence. Now the outcome depended on the king's whims. Inside the palace rooms where gossip thrived, attendants whispered in tones that pretended to be sympathetic. Some blamed the queen. Too timid, too cold, too unfamiliar. Others blamed the king. Too distracted, too calculating, too aware of the power the delay granted him. No one spoke of the truth, that the entire situation was orchestrated, designed to keep the queen off balance. The court uncertain, and the political landscape pliable. Time, in such circumstances, became a peculiar force. Days stretched with unbearable slowness for the queen. Nights were worse. The silence from the king's chambers felt like a verdict delivered without explanation. She rehearsed her posture, her speech, her composure, determined to project readiness should he come to her door. Yet she recognized the cruelty in preparing endlessly for a moment, denied to her. Every morning, she dressed with the dignity expected of a queen, even though she knew she was queen in appearance alone. Consummation was more than a ceremony. It was the key that unlocked her authority. Without it, she could not secure her household, command loyalty, or claim the privileges that came with her crown. She remained a figurehead, suspended in uncertainty, and the court treated her accordingly. Servants hesitated before addressing her. Advisors spoke to her with cautious neutrality. Even her ladies-in-waiting watched her with the subtle curiosity of women who understood that her fate rested on forces beyond her control. Some delays stretched only a few nights. Others lasted weeks. But the most dangerous were those that extended into months. In those rare cases, fear rippled through the palace like a draught beneath a heavy door. A queen kept waiting for so long, risked becoming irrelevant. Rumors about her circulated freely, not because anyone believed them, but because uncertainty demanded explanation. The king's silence created a void, and the void swallowed her dignity, one whisper at a time. Crises emerged quietly, then violently. Advisors urged resolution. Ambassadors demanded clarity. Families pressed for answers concealed behind diplomatic courtesy. The king alone remained calm, rising above the unrest he himself had crafted. His delay, after all, cost him nothing. It cost the queen everything. The cruelty of this tactic lay in its plausibility. To outsiders, the king appeared careful, thoughtful, and concerned with political stability. To the queen, the delay felt like a verdict suspended over her head. She could not appeal it. She could only endure it, knowing the palace held its breath, waiting for signs of her collapse. And still, the court normalized the practice. They spoke of the delay as though it were a natural part of royal life, not a deliberate humiliation. They valued the king's caution over the queen's suffering, the kingdom's strategy over her humanity. In such a world, a woman's worth remained tied not to her character or intelligence, but to an act withheld at someone else's convenience. A queen who finally received the king in her chamber felt relief shadowed by resentment. The act that should have cemented her status instead reminded her how precarious her position had been. Yet, even consummation did not erase the memory of those suspended days, of the dread that had seeped into her bones while the palace speculated behind closed doors. In the end, a postponed night wielded more power than any spoken vow. Beyond the hollow ceremonies, other uncertainties gathered, feeding on the silence between king and queen. Along the palace's darker passages, a tension waited to reveal how fragile influence could become. In the Tudor Court, the marriage bed was often spoken of as a place of blessing, the site where alliances were sealed and futures secured. But for many women, the bed became something far darker, a stage where obedience was extracted, not given, where intimacy was demanded, not offered. What should have been a moment of union transformed instead into a ritual of pressure, fear, and humiliation. The court understood this cruelty and accepted it without hesitation, because the bed served their interests long before it acknowledged a woman's humanity. Some queens entered the chamber already trembling under the weight of expectation. They knew that consummation was not simply encouraged, it was required, observed, and sometimes enforced with a vigilance that stripped the act of any semblance of dignity. Advisors, ladies in waiting, and even senior courtiers whispered reminders of duty, as though pleasure or consent played no part in the exchange. A royal wife's worth began with her ability to submit, and submission demanded that she silence every instinct that recoiled from the pressure laid upon her. For certain women, refusal was not an option. The king, eager to display his authority or anxious to confirm his virility, might insist upon immediate proof. His impatience gathered like storm clouds, and the queen, often a stranger in a foreign palace, felt the weight of an entire nation pressing her into the sheets. To deny him meant risking accusations of resistance, coldness, or even treasonous defiance. And so she endured, knowing her suffering would be framed as duty, her silence as loyalty. More disturbing still were the cases in which the consummation was monitored. The court did not trust whispers, it demanded certainty. While attendants did not stand directly at the bedside, they lingered just beyond heavy drapes or thick doors, listening for signs that the ritual had begun. Some waited to examine the linens afterward, faces composed, voices dutiful. as though performing a sacred task rather than intruding upon the most private corner of a marriage. These procedures robbed the queen of the last remnants of privacy, turning her into a spectacle hidden only by thin layers of fabric. To the court, such oversight was practical. To the queen, it was a nightmare. Her body was not hers. It was the kingdom's ledger, the king's possession, the council's proof. Every gesture she made, every breath, every sound, every attempt to steady herself, became part of a scrutiny so intense it bordered on cruelty. The court enjoyed thinking of itself as civilized, refined, and guided by moral order. Yet behind those polished ideals lay a willingness to treat a woman's body as both battlefield and evidence, sacrificing her dignity to maintain their carefully constructed hierarchy. Even when consummation occurred, the damage did not end. The memory lingered, clinging to her like a bruise no one could see. She carried it through corridors, into councils, through ceremonies where she was praised as queen. People spoke to her with reverence, unaware, or unwilling to acknowledge, that her coronation had begun with coercion. She learned quickly that appearances mattered more than truth. If the alliance held, if the king appeared satisfied, if the kingdom's stability remained unshaken, then the cost paid in her body was considered acceptable, expected, forgettable. Yet some queens could not carry the weight in silence. Their movements stiffened, their smiles dulled, their voices dimmed. Ladies in waiting noticed the change first, sensing the heaviness that wrapped itself around their mistress. But even they were powerless to intervene, bound by their own fear of the king's disfavour. In the palace, to question the king's actions was to question the very structure of power, a sin punished more swiftly than cruelty. Worse still was the way the court defended its brutality. Advisors insisted that consummation was necessary for legitimacy. Priests declared it essential for divine order. Courtiers dismissed discomfort as girlish nerves. And the king, shielded by authority, never faced consequences for using intimacy as a tool of domination. The queen alone bore the bruises, some physical, others carved into memory. While maintaining the appearance of harmony, the court demanded. In such an environment, the bed no longer symbolized union. It symbolized submission. It symbolized the moment a queen learned that duty required the erasure of self. It symbolized the palace's quiet belief that a woman's pain was a reasonable price for political certainty. And once that lesson settled into her bones, she understood that the court had no intention of protecting her. She was expected to endure, because endurance preserved the structure of power. In the end, the wedding bed exposed how violence could be disguised as duty. Beyond its velvet curtains, further demands gathered, tightening around a queen with every passing day. Through the palace's dim corridors, another ritual was prepared to reveal just how little mercy the court possessed. Any hint of a badly timed pregnancy carried a dangerous weight in the Tudor court. The palace could tolerate ambition, envy, or even quiet disobedience, but it could not abide uncertainty around lineage. A woman married into royalty understood immediately that her body was not merely her own. It was a ledger to be inspected, measured, and interpreted. If her belly swelled in a way the court did not expect, suspicion sharpened like a blade drawn in a darkened room. What should have been joy became a quiet sentence, waiting for its name. The chamber where a queen slept, soft linens, carved wood, candlelit, quiet, was never truly private. Servants moved in and out, eyes lowered yet observant. Advisors lingered nearby. Courtiers watched her habits, her appetite, her movements, searching for signs they could twist into narratives. If she appeared too pale, they whispered. If she appeared too flushed, they whispered more. A simple change in posture could become evidence in a story she never agreed to inhabit. Rumours began with astonishing ease. A maid who stepped into the wrong corridor at night might swear she heard voices behind the queen's door. A courtier passing by might notice a shadow, a murmure, a candle extinguished too quickly. These fragments, meaningless alone, fused into accusations powerful enough to destroy her life. The court loved nothing more than stitching darkness from threads of ordinary moments. It was not truth they sought, but confirmation of their own fears. The king's mood could determine everything. If his affection cooled or his trust faltered, even slightly, advisers moved swiftly. They murmured about impropriety, about the queen's behavior, about whether she had been left unguarded too often. They questioned which men served near her chambers, which women dressed her, and which visitors had lingered. What began as curiosity hardened into suspicion, and suspicion into formal inquiry. The queen, once celebrated, found herself ensnared before she could draw breath to defend her innocence. Inside the palace, a queen accused of conceiving improperly faced a horror few could imagine. Men she barely knew interrogated her as though she were a criminal. Physicians inspected her body with cold detachment, searching for signs that aligned with political necessity. Her own testimony, her memories, her truth, held little weight. The court did not question whether she was guilty. It questioned how efficiently her guilt could be proven. The bridal bed, which once symbolized alliance, became a silent witness, twisted against her. If she conceived too soon, they called it deceit. If she conceived too late, they called it manipulation. If the king's attentions were known to wander, they blamed her for seeking affection elsewhere. Every pathway led back to accusation. A queen found herself balancing her life on details she could not control. The king's desire, the timing of conception, the whispers of those who envied her. Others suffered because of the court's hunger for spectacle. Ladies-in-waiting were interrogated until their answers blurred. Servants were punished for hesitating. Families were dragged into the storm, forced to defend a daughter whose voice mattered least in matters of her own body. A queen watched all of this unfold, knowing the palace would rather destroy her than admit its own cruelty. The threat of execution hovered over every step she took. The court framed such punishments as righteous, necessary, ordained by law and faith. But everyone understood the truth behind the ornate language. When a queen became inconvenient, rumour offered a swift and elegant exit. The accusation of infidelity struck at the heart of the monarchy. With one carefully crafted story, her enemies could turn the entire kingdom against her. The tragedy deepened when the queen realized how quickly affection could evaporate. Those who once bowed at her presence now watched her with suspicion. Conversations quieted when she entered a room. Even the walls felt sharper, as though listening. She moved through the palace with slow, measured grace, aware that every gesture could be interpreted as a confession. Her silence became both shield and accusation. Few experiences matched the terror of lying awake at night, knowing the child within her. Innocent, wordless, unseen, could condemn her before she ever held it. A queen, trapped between her body and the kingdom that claimed it, understood how fear could hollow a person long before punishment arrived. She clutched the blankets, staring into the darkness, wondering whether sunrise would bring safety or the first step toward ruin. What made the fear unbearable was not its violence, but its plausibility. The court did not need proof, it needed motive. And a queen's vulnerability provided endless opportunities to manufacture one. Every woman who walked these halls understood the unspoken truth. Desire was irrelevant. Innocence was irrelevant. Loyalty was irrelevant. Survival depended only on whether the court found value in letting her live. Ultimately, a single rumour could wound more deeply than any blade drawn in daylight. Beyond the uneasy glow of the torches, other stories gathered, each one eager to reshape a queen's fate. Across the palace's shifting shadows, A new struggle was preparing to unsettle every alliance. She thought she understood. A Tudor wedding night never belonged to just two people. Long before the king approached the bridal chamber, rivalries had already taken root in the shadows. Wives who feared displacement, mistresses who feared irrelevance, and royal mothers who feared losing influence over the throne. The bed, draped in velvet and guarded by ceremony, served not as a sanctuary but as a contested field where every woman connected to the king measured her place against the others. No blade was drawn, yet the quiet tension between them crackled with the same lethal intent found on any battlefield. Every woman in the king's orbit understood what that single night meant. Whoever shared the king's bed first did more than consummate a marriage. She claimed authority, proximity, and the right to shape the rhythms of power. Even before the wedding feast ended, subtle looks passed between factions. A smile held too long. A whisper dropped intentionally. A pause in conversation that revealed more than words ever could. Behind each gesture lay the same unspoken fear. What if someone else reaches him first? The queen, though ostensibly the central figure, often felt like the least secure participant in this silent war. She entered the marriage already surrounded by women who wished to sabotage, redirect, or claim the king's attention for themselves. Some had known him for years, had shared his laughter, his grief, or his secrets. Others had entered his life only recently, but carried the sharp ambition that thrives in palaces built on rumor. They circled her politely, offering assisted smiles and courteous greetings, though each greeting held the weight of threat. Mistress, especially, studied the bridal night with cold precision. They watched the queen's posture, her health, her nerves. They noted whether the king's gaze lingered or slipped away. A mistress who sensed weakening favor might attempt one final approach, a word in the king's ear, a reminder of shared intimacy, a plea disguised as confidence. She understood that once the king lay with his wife, her influence might shift forever. So she fought in the only ways allowed, through charm, through memory, through carefully timed sorrow. Royal mothers entered the fray with a different motivation. Their fear was not personal rejection, but political displacement. A young queen threatened their authority, their counsel, and their control over the king's decisions. If the queen conceived quickly, that threat multiplied. Thus, the king's mother watched the wedding night with the calculating stillness of someone who knew the stakes intimately. Her expressions were soft, yet her mind measured advantage and loss with ruthless clarity. Even the servants felt the tension. They carried garments, poured wine, and lit candles with trembling hands. They sensed the electricity in the air. The brittle balance of factions, a misplaced word or poorly timed smile could align them with the wrong side. In the Tudor world, proximity to the marital bed carried its own dangers. Inside the chamber itself, the queen felt the scrutiny long before she crossed the threshold. The bed, heavy with expectation, seemed to pulse with invisible eyes. She knew that the chamber doors were hardly a barrier. Behind them, women waited, no matter how composed their posture, how serene their faces. They waited. They listened for footsteps, for voices, for any sign that the king had chosen her without hesitation. Yet nothing was simple in the palace. Sometimes the king lingered outside the chamber, speaking quietly with an advisor, a friend, or a woman from his past. These brief pauses, harmless in ordinary life, became rifts in the queen's confidence. Were they discussing state matters? Or discussing her? Was he hesitating? Was someone else? A rival. A confidante. Guiding his decision in that moment before the door closed? The truth was that every woman connected to the king lived with the same volatile uncertainty. The king's desire, unpredictable and shifting, could elevate one and destroy another in a single night. The queen might enter the bed as victor, only to wake at dawn hearing whispers that another woman had visited the king later. Or a mistress might believe herself forgotten, only to find a renewed pull in his heart after a politically strained wedding night. The bridal bed was not the end of rivalry, it was its ignition. The queen, lying beside the king, felt the full gravity of that truth. She shared the bed with him, but she also shared it with every gaze silently cast upon it. Behind the curtains, beneath the embroidered quilts, she carried the weight of women who wanted her place, women who feared her presence, and women who would gladly see her fall if it meant securing their own fragile influence. And the king, whether indifferent or amused, allowed the silent war to continue. His whims fed it, his unpredictability sharpened it, his affections, unstable, intense, fleeting, bound the women to a competition none of them could openly acknowledge. Yet all of them fought. Ultimately, the bed crowned no woman without wounding another in the process. Beyond the chamber's hush, rivalries tightened like cords drawn slowly together. Amid the palace's restless silence, a new contest stirred, one that would test loyalty far more cruelly than desire. Silence in a royal bedchamber was never just silence in the Tudor court. It was a message, a warning, a riddle wrapped in sheets left untouched. When the king chose not to visit any woman's room, the palace reacted with a tension so sharp it felt like cold metal drawn through the halls. His absence from the bed meant more than the refusal of intimacy. It meant a withdrawal of favour, of alliances, of direction. Every faction, every rival, every woman who depended on proximity to the king felt the ground shift beneath them. Courtiers tried to pretend nothing was amiss. They greeted one another with stiff courtesy, commented on the weather, the harvest, and the latest diplomatic letters. Yet beneath the polite murmurs, fear collected like dust in corners. If the king slept alone, who could rise? Who could fall? Which family would lose influence? Which advisors' hold over him had begun to loosen? No one dared to ask aloud. In the Tudor court, questions were far more dangerous than guesses. The women closest to the king sensed the danger immediately. The queen, accustomed to the rituals of shared nights, whether tender or merely strategic, felt the chill first. When he avoided her chamber without explanation, she lay awake, staring at the carved canopy above her, understanding that the absence spoke louder than any argument could. A king turns away from his wife only when his loyalties are shifting, or when his court is growing hostile to her presence. Both possibilities felt like knives poised above her. Mistresses felt the blow differently. Their influence was nothing without access. Their worth depended entirely on whether the king sought them. When he sought no one, they found themselves stranded between longing and terror. Was he losing interest? Was he turning to political counsel instead of personal comfort? Had rumours reached him? Had new alliances begun to form out of sight? The bed they once imagined as refuge now stood as a cold symbol of their fading place in his world. Even the king's mother, a figure of immense stability and control, watched the situation with sharpened caution. A king who avoided the marital bed suggested unrest within his heart or his advisors, and either could endanger the dynasty. She knew too well how quickly the court could unravel when affection withdrew from the palace's centre. Her composure remained immaculate, but every step she took carried the weight of urgent calculation. In chambers where advisors gathered, the silence felt even heavier. A king who refused to choose a companion for the night was a king who withheld his intentions. Ministers feared such refusals because they signalled contemplation. And contemplation meant change. Which policies might shift? Which alliances might collapse? A king in solitude was a king thinking dangerously beyond their grasp. Rumours crawled across the palace before sunrise. Servants whispered that the king had been seen pacing late into the night. Guards claimed he stood at his window for hours, staring at the courtyard as though waiting for something he could not name. Others claimed he refused supper, or dismissed musicians early, or burned letters rather than answering them. Every detail, no matter how trivial, was gathered, exaggerated, and interpreted with frantic urgency. But the greatest fear emerged from the simplest truth. If no woman shared his bed, then no woman held his ear. If no woman held his ear, then no faction could claim advantage. And if no faction could claim advantage, then chaos, quiet but lethal, seeped into every corridor. The Queen felt this chaos most acutely. A king who avoids all beds is a king who avoids hers. And without her bed, she possessed no anchor, no assurance, no claim over the court's shifting loyalties. She dressed with precision, spoke with practiced calm, but beneath her composure lay a tight thread of dread. She knew the court measured her worth not by her crown, but by her proximity to the king, and proximity was slipping from her hands. Nights stretched thinner, colder. The king withdrew further into himself, his solitude feeding rumours, and rumours feeding fear. The palace's pulse shifted. Conversations faltered. Tensions rose. The royal bed, untouched, became the loudest voice in the kingdom, a voice announcing that something fundamental had fractured beneath the glittering surface of power. In a world where intimacy meant influence, a king who slept with no one stripped the court of its most reliable compass. Every alliance trembled. Every rival sharpened her gaze. Every whispered plan recalibrated itself around his silence. Ultimately, the king's empty bed echoed louder than any argument spoken in daylight. Beyond its untouched sheets, new uncertainties gathered, waiting for the first sign of vulnerability to emerge. Across the palace's tightening breath, a deeper crisis stirred, one that would soon demand a reckoning none of them could postpone. A king who never reached his wedding bed left behind more than an unfinished chapter. He left a void that unsettled the entire kingdom. Edward VI, young, frail, and burdened with a crown far heavier than his slight shoulders could bear, never touched the rituals that defined adulthood in the Tudor world. No bride was brought to him, no chamber prepared, no night marked as the beginning of a lineage. His untouched bed, quietly preserved in a palace that expected heirs, became a symbol of the future England would never receive. In the Tudor court, a king's succession rested not only on his legitimacy, but on his ability to continue the line. Without consummation, without even the prospect of it, Edward's reign carried a strange hollowness, a sense that each year was only borrowed time. Courtiers greeted him with obedience, but behind every bow lay a quiet calculation. Who will rule after him? Who will inherit the throne if he leaves no child? These questions pressed against the palace walls long before Edward's health began to fail. Each faction saw opportunity in the vacuum surrounding him. His young age made him malleable. His isolation made him accessible. And his lack of a queen left the political landscape dangerously open. Councillors clustered around him like hawks circling a fragile branch, each claiming to act in his interest while carving paths toward their own ambitions. Without a bride to anchor alliances, these men built power by proximity alone, whispering into the king's ear, shaping his decisions, guiding his doubts. Edward, intelligent yet painfully aware of his vulnerability, sensed the shifting tensions. The palace that should have protected him instead pressed inward with cold curiosity. He walked through corridors where adult voices hushed at his approach, where letters vanished when he entered a room, where advisors exchanged glances that carried meanings he was never invited to interpret. His youth, rather than earning him gentleness, made him an instrument for others' control. As the years passed without any sign of marital arrangements, the gossip grew sharper. Some whispered that he was too weak to consummate a marriage, that his thin limbs and persistent illnesses foretold a lineage that would never take root. Others insisted that the council intentionally postponed his union to maintain their grip over him. A boy king without a queen was a king without independent power. With no woman beside him, no household of his own, he remained bound to the men who governed through him. The symbolism of his empty wedding bed came to define the anxieties of the court. Rooms were prepared for ceremonies that never came. Tapestries were chosen, then stored. Drafts of potential marriage treaties circulated, but dissolved before they could reach negotiation. Meanwhile, foreign princesses, named as possible brides, lived unaware of how their absence deepened England's instability. Each year without a queen sharpened the question: what happens when this boy becomes a memory? When Edward's health began its downward spiral, the palace transformed into a hive of urgent secrecy. Advisors moved with hushed voices and quickened steps. Documents were drafted in shadowed chambers. Alliances shifted overnight. The boy king's untouched wedding bed became the stark evidence of England's impending crisis. With no heir in sight, the succession opened like a wound, exposing every ambition long hidden beneath polished courtly masks. Some factions rallied behind Lady Jane Grey, others behind Mary, and others still behind Elizabeth. Each claimed the right to determine England's path, and each used Edward's lack of consummation, his unfulfilled role as a husband and father, as justification for their chosen successor. The king, lying pale and exhausted, became absent from his own future. He watched as others debated what his legacy should be, even as he felt it slipping through his fingers. His death brought no peace to the palace. Instead, it unleashed a storm. The young king's body had barely cooled before rival factions surged into action, each arguing that they alone understood his final wishes. His empty bridal chamber, untouched and quiet, became the symbol of the monarchy's fragility, a reminder that a kingdom resting on the shoulders of a child could not stand without the stabilizing force of lineage. In the end, Edward VI left the world as he had lived within it, surrounded by power yet denied its certainty. A king without a queen, without a consummated marriage, without an heir. His untouched bed echoed with the ambitions of others, each one eager to claim what he could not secure. And the kingdom, suddenly without direction, plunged into a contest shaped more by fear than loyalty. Ultimately, the bed left empty by a dying king carried the weight of a nation trembling for answers. Beyond the quiet of his final chamber, rival forces gathered, hungry to seize the space his youth left behind. Through the palace's uneasy dawn, a struggle awakened, one that would test how far England was willing to bend in the absence of certainty. Power in the Tudor court often depended less on truth than on belief, and no belief spread faster than the suggestion that a woman had shared the king's bed. Some learned to wield this with frightening skill. They mastered the art of implication, shaping glances and carefully timed gestures into a story the court would rush to complete on its own. A woman might never step inside the king's chamber, never hear his voice in private, never feel his hand on hers, yet still rise in influence simply by allowing others to imagine she had. In a palace built on suspicion, the appearance of closeness mattered more than the closeness itself. The game began subtly, a lowered gaze at breakfast, a smile withheld until the perfect moment, a sudden confidence in her movements as though she moved with a secret she dared not name aloud. Those who watched, all servants, courtiers, rivals, interpreted every detail as confirmation of their hopes or fears. People see what they wish to see. And in the Tudor court, they always wished, always twished, oh, see advantage. Her silence, far from denying the rumour, nourished it. Silence is a seed, gossip is the soil. Some women leaned into the whispers deliberately. They let their chamber doors remain slightly open at night, as though expecting a royal visit. They appeared at court with a new steadiness, as though strengthened by intimacy. They carried themselves with a dignity just shy of arrogance, signalling without speaking, "I have been chosen." The court responded immediately. Men shifted their alliances. Women recalculated their loyalties, and every faction adjusted positions in anticipation of her rising influence. The king, amused or oblivious, rarely intervened. His indifference allowed the lie to breathe, as long as the rumour benefited him, distracting rivals, unsettling the queen, fracturing factions. He had no incentive to correct it, and so the court continued guessing, analysing the smallest details of the woman's day. Did she leave the hall early? Did she blush when the king entered? Did she wear a colour he favoured? Every movement was measured, catalogued, and weaponized into evidence. Meanwhile, the queen watched with quiet dread. She knew the truth. Yet the truth held little weight in the palace. Influence did not depend on facts. It depended on perception. Each whisper chipped away at her standing. Each rumour tightened the noose of insecurity around her crown. She could not confront the woman accused of sharing the king's favour. For to accuse was to acknowledge vulnerability. To remain silent was to risk appearing weak. Either choice fed the rumour further. The rivals, emboldened by uncertainty, joined the dance. Some encouraged the whispers to weaken the queen's position. Others sought to ride the rumour's momentum to their own advantage. It took only one night, even an imagined one, to rearrange alliances throughout the kingdom. In this world, a woman did not need affection to gain power. She needed only to be believed capable of receiving it. Yet the danger of this game lay in its volatility. Rumours inflamed quickly but burned out just as fast. A woman who rose on whispers alone often found herself isolated when the court's attention shifted. Rivals who envied her influence delighted in watching her fall, and they manoeuvred to turn suspicion upon her. If the king showed interest elsewhere, or if a new candidate for his affections entered the palace, the once powerful woman found herself suddenly fragile. The rumour that built her prestige became the tool used to dismantle it. Worse still, the game sometimes escalated into outright deceit. A woman might allow her attendants to hint at nighttime visits. She might stage situations. A candle burning too late. Footsteps heard outside her door that suggested a clandestine meeting. She might even plant objects in her chamber that implied the king's presence. The court, always eager for scandal, rarely questioned these theatrics. They desired stories more than accuracy. But the most dangerous moment came when the rumour crossed into politics. Once advisers believed the woman held the king's ear. They began treating her as a channel for influence. They offered gifts, sought private conversations, and aligned themselves with her faction. Her illusion of proximity became a fragile currency, powerful when spent carefully, but devastating when exposed as counterfeit. Some women managed to convert the illusion into genuine favour, catching the king's attention after the fact. Others suffered humiliating collapses when the truth surfaced. But all understood one thing. In the Tudor court, power seldom belonged to those who deserved it. It belonged to those who could make others believe they possessed it. The palace did not thrive on truth. It thrived on echoes. Soft at first, then louder, then impossible to silence. Ultimately, a whispered claim could shift the court more violently than any verified truth. Beyond the dim corridors, other fabrications gathered strength, preparing to distort loyalties once again. Toward the palace's tense horizon, a subtler cruelty stirred, one ready to unravel lives with nothing more than suggestion. A Tudor bridal chamber glowed with candlelight. Yet beneath the warm shimmer lay a cold and merciless truth. No night in a woman's life carried more danger than the one meant to celebrate her union. The door that closed behind her did not simply separate her from the world. It judged her, measured her, and determined whether she would rise or be erased without a sound. For some, the bridal bed was the threshold to unimaginable power. For others, it became the last room they ever entered, with dignity intact. The palace pretended that this night was sacred, a moment of tenderness and blessing. But every woman knew better. The whispers had followed her for weeks. Questions about her purity, her temperament, her usefulness to the crown. She felt the weight of those whispers as she stepped toward the bed, each footfall carrying the expectation of families, Izingrax, and foreign alliances. A single moment of hesitation, a tremor, a wrong expression, could shift her fate before she ever touched the sheets. Behind the closed door, she faced not intimacy, but examination. The king's mood shaped the atmosphere like a storm moving through a narrow valley. If he approached her with warmth, she had a chance. A fragile one, but real. If he approached with indifference, she walked a tighter ledge. And if he approached with resentment or obligation, the night stretched into something colder, harsher, unforgiving. Some brides reached the bed trembling, painfully aware that even their breath might be interpreted. The king, heavy with expectation from advisors and ancestors alike, scrutinized her reactions. Was she compliant? Was she frightened? Was she appropriately modest? The wrong balance could plant seeds of disdain. A king who felt disappointed, for reasons he might never articulate, could change the course of her life before dawn. The consummation expected of her was not merely physical. It was political proof. Her body served as evidence, a marker that the alliance lived. Outside the chamber, attendants waited with ritualistic patience. Some lingered in corridors. Others plotted in side rooms, ears tuned for any hint of success or failure. The queen's status hung on noises too delicate to name, too humiliating to confront. In this world, privacy was not a right. It was a temporary illusion. For certain women, the outcome transformed them instantly. The king emerged satisfied. The attendants found proof on the sheets, and the court erupted into a soft blaze of triumph. By sunrise, she possessed a new household, a new authority, a new identity. She walked through corridors with eyes lowered, yet heart racing. I survived the night. I have become queen in truth. Her rivals watched with bitterness, because they understood that a single successful night had elevated her beyond their reach. At least for now. But not every woman crossed that threshold with fortune. Some brides entered the same chamber and never re-emerged unchanged. Some were rejected before a hand ever touched them. Dismissed, because the king found them unappealing or politically inconvenient. Others endured the night only to be declared inadequate. Too cold, too shy, too unwilling, or, in crueler interpretations, too experienced. A king displeased could flatten their futures in a single phrase spoken to an advisor. And then there were the women who endured something far worse. They awakened to find themselves unnecessary. A king might leave before dawn, not explain. Servants might lead her back to her rooms with stiff courtesy. By midday, whispers roamed freely. The king had doubts. The consummation was questionable. The alliance might dissolve. Plans formed around her without her knowledge. Annulment, dismissal, or quiet return to her family estate. Her brief glimpse of power dissolved like breath on cold glass. Some brides never even reached morning. Panic, humiliation, or sudden rejection pushed them into collapse. A few suffered a fate sealed by men who wanted them gone. Their stories slipped easily out of the record, the palace ensuring that their failures remained unnamed. The Tudor Court excelled at erasing women who disrupted its narrative. Yet perhaps the most chilling truth was how easily all of this was accepted. The court considered it normal, necessary, even divine in structure. A woman's entire destiny rested on a single night, orchestrated by forces she could not control. She was expected to carry herself with grace while navigating a ritual designed not for love but for scrutiny. Those who survived learned to wear their triumph like armor. Those who failed disappeared, their names preserved only as cautionary tales whispered to future brides. And every woman who approached the bridal chamber did so with the same awareness. The bed might crown her, or it might swallow her whole. Ultimately, the wedding night revealed how thin the line was between exaltation and erasure. Beyond the chamber's breathless stillness, other trials gathered, ready to test a woman's worth with sharper cruelty. Across the palace's waiting dark, a harsher reminder stirred that even survival carried a price extracted long after dawn. Anne of Cleves entered England with the gentle hope of fulfilling a duty she did not choose, unaware that her survival would depend not on charm or wit, but on the simple fact that the king refused to touch her. Her marriage to Henry VIII, arranged with all the weight of diplomacy and expectation, dissolved almost as quickly as it began, not through scandal or treason, but through a quiet, devastating omission. The bed meant to legitimize their union remained untouched, and in that untouched space lay the strange mercy that saved her life. When Anne first met the king, Henry approached her in disguise, an old habit he believed displayed romantic flair. She, unfamiliar with English customs and unaware of his identity, offered only polite confusion. The moment wounded his vanity so profoundly that he never forgave her for failing to recognize a king hiding beneath a stranger's mask. From that first encounter, her fate bent in a direction she could neither predict nor resist. The palace watched the unfolding tension with the fascination reserved for misfortune. Servants saw the king's forced smiles, the stiffness in his posture, the strained conversations during public meals. Courtiers noted how quickly his affection evaporated, how his gaze slid past her in hallways, how he refused to speak of plans. A king's displeasure spread like frost, killing the warmth around it long before anyone dared ask why. Anne entered the bridal chamber on her wedding night, carrying the weight of expectation, the fear of disappointing a husband she barely knew, and the hope that duty might soften his heart. But Henry did not join her. Not once. Each night he slept elsewhere, offering excuses that sounded almost rehearsed. Exhaustion, illness, distraction, obligations. Behind these hollow words lay a deeper truth. He simply did not want her. Days passed, then weeks. Rumours crept through the palace like cold drafts. Anne's attendants whispered anxiously. Diplomats wrote letters filled with cautious phrasing. The court held its breath, waiting for signs of consummation that never appeared. For in the Tudor world, an unconsummated marriage was not merely incomplete, it was reversible. The king clung to this fact with growing eagerness. He began gathering evidence to support the claim that the marriage was invalid. He insisted Anne had misrepresented herself, that he had been deceived, that he found her unattractive to a degree that made marital intimacy impossible. These accusations, cruel in their simplicity, became the foundation of a political escape route he fully intended to take. Anne, isolated and bewildered, felt the tension tightening around her like an invisible thread. She had done nothing wrong, yet the blame settled on her shoulders. She wanted to speak, to insist that she had followed every expectation, that she had offered respect, patience, and dignity. But the Tudor court did not care for a woman's truth, only for the king's narrative. When the council summoned her, she understood the precariousness of her position. Henry VIII was a man whose displeasure had already cost 2 queens their lives. The air in the chamber trembled with this unspoken knowledge. Advisers spoke in controlled tones, offering condolences disguised as legal explanation. Anne listened, absorbing their words with a calmness earned, not through confidence but through terror. The king declared the marriage unconsummated. The council agreed, and in that agreement, the end of her queenship was sealed. Yet within the cruelty lay a strange, life-preserving grace. Because Henry had never touched her, Anne could not be accused of adultery. She could not be charged with betrayal. The king had no grounds to destroy her, only to dismiss her. And so she was removed from the throne, not with a sword, but with a pen. Anne accepted the annulment, not because she believed she deserved it, but because she wished to live. She relinquished her crown and, in return, received estates, wealth, and a new title, the king's beloved sister. It was both an honor and an exile, a name crafted to soothe political wounds while keeping her safely outside the royal bed's dangerous orbit. To the surprise of many, she adapted. She grew gardens, hunted, entertained guests, and crafted a quiet existence, insulated from the king's whims. While other wives faced execution, imprisonment, or disgrace, Anne lived on, a reminder that in the Tudor world, survival often belonged not to the most powerful women, but to those whom the king found easiest to ignore. Her empty marriage bed, the symbol of her rejection, became the unexpected reason she outlived nearly everyone who once pitied her. Ultimately, Anne's untouched bed became the shield that spared her from a fate shared by far stronger women. Beyond the gentle quiet of her new estates, the court whispered of her with curiosity, unsure whether to envy or dismiss her escape. Through the shifting tensions of Henry's later reign, a deeper truth lingered, that sometimes salvation came not from favour, but from being forgotten at the right moment. Catherine Howard entered the Tudor court like a spark landing in dry grass. Bright, delicate, and doomed to ignite everything around her. Barely more than a girl, she carried a softness mistaken for innocence and a liveliness mistaken for safety. But nothing was safe in Henry VIII's palace, least of all beauty. Her youth, her charm, and her effortless ability to draw admiration became both her crown and her curse. From the moment Henry's eyes settled on her, the court understood that this girl's life would unfold under a scrutiny so relentless it would strip her of breath long before it stripped her of freedom. The king adored her with a fervour swollen by age and insecurity. Catherine represented something he believed he had lost: vitality, admiration, the illusion of renewed youth. He lavished her with jewels, silks, feasts, and praises spoken too loudly. But the louder his affection grew, the more sharply the court's attention turned toward her. Every movement she made was watched. Every smile she offered was analysed. Every step outside her chamber stirred a dozen whispered theories about whether she meant to seek companionship or merely a breath of unmonitored air. Catherine, raised in a household careless with discipline, did not understand the magnitude of the danger. She had lived surrounded by flirtation, laughter, stolen moments, and the spirited chaos of youth. She did not carry the cold caution of Anne Boleyn or the weary vigilance of Catherine of Aragon. She believed kindness meant safety. She believed affection meant protection. No one told her that in the Tudor world, affection could be a trap more lethal than hatred. Once she became queen, the court tightened around her like a closing fist. Ladies-in-waiting were chosen not for loyalty to her, but for loyalty to the council. Servants were positioned strategically. Guards lingered near her doors, even when no threat was present. The palace had transformed into a net, and she, unaware, became the creature fluttering at its centre. Because the king adored her, everyone else feared her. Ambassadors wrote anxious letters warning their courts of the king's obsession. Advisors watched her closely, terrified she might influence decisions with a soft voice and a warm smile. Rivals studied her every gesture, searching for signs of weakness or impropriety. And those who envied her sought any excuse to topple a girl who had risen too quickly, too effortlessly. It did not help that Catherine carried a past the court would use against her. Before becoming queen, she had flirted, laughed, exchanged letters, even shared moments of naive intimacy, never imagining those memories would become weapons. These were not crimes in youth, yet the palace collected them like sharpened stones, waiting for their moment to strike. She tried to be a good queen, gentle, gracious, eager to please. But Henry's overwhelming desire only tightened her noose. He visited her often, sometimes unexpectedly, and she learned quickly that a queen married to such a king possessed no true privacy. Even affection became surveillance. Courtiers listened outside the doors. Advisors documented rumors. Servants exchanged glances, heavy with implication. Worse still was the way the palace interpreted her innocence as guilt. Catherine's friendliness, which had once been her charm, became suspicious. A shared laugh with a gentleman could be misread. A kind word to a servant could be twisted. A music request, a desire for fresh air, even a moment of solitude, became evidence of forbidden longing. The court wanted a scandal, and Catherine, fragile and unguarded, offered them endless opportunities to invent one. Meanwhile, Henry's devotion slowly transformed from worship into possession. He wanted Catherine entirely, her attention, her thoughts, her every breath accounted for. He read jealousy as loyalty, paranoia as love. His court, hungry to maintain favor, fed his fears with stories disguised as concern. And Catherine, still too young to understand the depth of royal suspicion, walked directly into the storm they prepared for her. The turning point arrived with the reopening of her past. Old letters surfaced. Former suitors reappeared in whispered testimony. A once playful adolescence hardened into accusations of treasonous deceit. Catherine, hearing her own history recited as evidence, felt the world tilt beneath her. She tried to defend herself, but her tears were dismissed as manipulation and her fear interpreted as guilt. When the council informed Henry, his devastation curdled instantly into rage. Affection became betrayal. Desire became humiliation. And the same king who had adored Catherine for her freshness now condemned her for the same innocent impulses he once praised. The palace moved swiftly. Guards removed her jewels, her attendants, her freedom. She was questioned by men older than her father, forced to listen as they dissected her life in tones devoid of empathy. Her chamber, once filled with warmth and music, became a holding cell lined with cold air and harsher truths. She was barely 19 when she was led to her death. Her final hours revealed a girl forced to confront the enormity of consequences no one had taught her to fear. She practiced placing her head on the block, trembling, trying desperately to steady herself. Those who watched saw not a traitor, not a seductress, but a child who had been thrust into a world designed to consume her. Catherine Howard did not die because she was wicked. She died because she was young in a court that punished youth more brutally than treason. Ultimately, Catherine's downfall proved how swiftly adoration could transform into execution. Beyond the echo of her final footsteps, other tragedies gathered, shaped by the court's hunger for control over women's lives. Through the kingdom's tightening grief, a darker warning stirred, reminding every future bride how perilously thin the line was between favor and destruction. The bed was never just a place to sleep. It was a stage where power performed its cruelest tricks. In the Tudor world, the canopy above was a crown in cloth, the sheets a political script, and whoever lay upon them declared far more than affection. When a king wished to punish his wife without lifting a sword, he had subtler weapons: humiliation, displacement, the quiet symbolism of absence and presence. Few tools were sharper than the act of bringing another woman into the marriage bed and letting the entire court feel the meaning without a single word spoken aloud. It began, usually, with tension simmering long before the chamber doors closed. A queen displeased the king, perhaps by failing to produce an heir, perhaps by resisting demands, perhaps simply by existing in a moment when his desire pointed elsewhere. In a world where women had no legal ground to stand on, a queen's survival depended entirely on her place in the king's private life. When that place shifted, the tremor could be felt down every corridor. A king did not need to announce his resentment. He could parade it. He could let the court see whom he preferred by allowing a mistress to sit closer, to speak longer, to laugh more freely, but nothing compared to the moment he allowed that mistress near the royal bed. A sanctified space meant only for the king and his lawful wife. It was an act that cut deeper than any spoken rebuke. It said, "You are replaceable." It said, "Your body holds no power here anymore." It said, "Watch how easily I can unmake you." For the queen, there was no defense. Rage was forbidden. Tears were mocked. Silence was expected. The posture of a dutiful wife collapsing inward, swallowing humiliation almost as part of her duty. Even her ladies-in-waiting, sworn to her service, could not protect her. They witnessed everything, recorded nothing, and carried the whispers outward like drifting embers. The king, reclining comfortably, could pretend innocence. He did nothing illegal, and also, he merely allowed the court to see which woman joined him late at night or left his chamber after dawn. These choices were not accidents. Every witness was intentional. Every rumor was encouraged. This was revenge, dressed in velvet and perfumed with power. For the mistress, the invitation into the marital bed was both triumph and terror. She knew the queen watched, even if from a distance. She knew the court judged her, some calling her cunning, others calling her doomed. Rising through a king's desire was a dangerous ascent. One shift in mood, and she could fall faster than she climbed. Yet in that moment, lying where only a queen should lie, she held a dangerous, glittering influence. And influence, in Tudor England, was the closest thing a woman could have to armor. The queen, meanwhile, bore the public consequences. Ministers approached her with cool formality. Ambassadors shifted their alliances. Servants hesitated before addressing her. Everyone waited to see whether she would retaliate or collapse. But retaliation was impossible. A queen who confronted her husband risked accusations of disobedience. A queen who ignored the insult appeared weak. A queen who cried alone in her chamber risked being labelled unstable. The trap was absolute. She was punished whichever direction she turned. And so, the humiliation hardened into a kind of performance. The queen sat beside the king in daylight, pretending nothing was wrong. Her posture steady, her gaze distant. The mistress glided through the palace with a fragile arrogance, aware that her triumph existed only as long as the king permitted it. The king, satisfied, watched both women tremble around him, one in anger, the other in fear, and mistook that trembling for control. The real audience was the court. They studied the shifting arrangement of bodies and bedding the way one studies omens. A mistress in the royal bed meant policy could change. A queen displaced meant alliances were collapsing. Every sigh, every smile, every unexplained absence fed the palace's appetite for speculation. This was the cruelty of the Tudor world. The bed, supposedly the most intimate space of marriage, became a political ledger. It recorded revenge, not affection, strategy, not passion. And when the king used it to humiliate his wife, the message spread far beyond the chamber. It reminded every family that their daughters were offerings, not partners. It reminded every noble that loyalty meant nothing beside desire. It reminded every woman that even queens could bleed without ever being touched. Some queens recovered, some endured, some vanished slowly, not through execution, but through erasure. Their names slipped from conversation, their presence thinned, their influence dissolved like ink left in the rain. The bed had undone them more thoroughly than any decree could. The tale settles into its bitter truth. A marriage bed can be turned into a blade when a king wishes to wound. A quiet shift in the shadows hints at a chamber where the door stays shut for reasons no one dares to name. And somewhere behind those guarded walls lies the moment when a forbidden command tears a life apart. The silence surrounding a royal bedchamber could become a weapon sharper than any sword. In the Tudor court, a king did not need violence to destroy a woman's future. He needed only to close a door and forbid anyone from crossing its threshold. A single command, spoken lightly, almost lazily, could ensure that no queen, no matter her rank or purity, would ever be allowed near the bed meant to secure her position. Courtiers understood the meaning at once. A woman denied entry to the royal bed was a woman denied existence. The bed was supposed to be her stage, the place where her body affirmed alliances, dynasties, and the king's will. But a locked chamber turned that stage into a void, stripping her of function and leaving her trapped in a strange half-life. Married in name, erased in practice. She was expected to smile at ceremonies, to play the gentle queen, to kneel beside a man who refused to grant her the one act that defined her status. Each night she returned to rooms filled with embroidered cushions and cold tapestries, knowing that the real power remained on the other side of a guarded door. The cruelty of such a command lay in its quietness. No one saw a queen being struck or dragged away. No bruises bloomed on her arms. Instead, the pain accumulated slowly, like frost creeping across a window. The king would dine, laugh, pray, and sleep elsewhere, making no announcement, offering no explanation. The court, ever hungry for meaning, fed on her humiliation. Every day she was not called to the royal chamber was another tally against her. Another whisper added to the murmuring corridors. Perhaps she had failed him. Perhaps she repulsed him. Perhaps she was barren already. A queen needed children if she hoped to survive. The absence of heirs was deadly enough when nature alone was responsible. It became lethal when the king himself engineered the emptiness. Men in power understood how to twist the narrative. A woman denied the chance to conceive could still be accused of failing to produce a child. It was an impossible trap. She could neither enter the bed nor defend herself from the punishment that followed. Her womb became a battlefield she was forbidden to fight on. On the surface, the king's command seemed almost administrative. A simple order, a private choice, perhaps even a temporary measure. But beneath that surface lay layers of cruelty disguised as royal prerogative. The queen might be told to wait, to remain patient, to trust in divine timing. Servants might bow and murmur that the king was busy or unwell. Yet every night her chamber remained untouched, and every morning her body remained unchanged. A reminder that she was slipping further from security. Meanwhile, the king moved freely. His steps echoed through corridors she was barred from. His moods shaped the rumors of the day. Sometimes he passed her with a polite nod, offering a gesture that felt more like mockery than courtesy. For the court, that nod could be interpreted in 100 ways. Perhaps he intended to return to her. Perhaps he was reconsidering. Perhaps she still had hope. Hope was a poison of its own. Queens held on to it long after reality had abandoned them. Behind the velvet curtains, rival factions watched closely. A vacant bed signaled opportunity. Advisors whispered that the king deserved a fertile bride. Ambitious families calculated how long a queen could endure before collapsing under the political weight of her childlessness. A door closed to her was a door opening for someone else. In the Tudor world, few things spread faster than the scent of vulnerability. For the queen trapped in this silent punishment, the nights were the hardest. She lay awake, staring at polished ceilings, imagining the life she was supposed to lead. The marriage that once promised protection now felt like a cage whose walls were padded with ceremony and expectation. She could not accuse the king without condemning herself. She could not speak the truth without risking treason. Silence was both her prison and her disguise. When her failure became official, when months passed without summons or child, courtiers began to craft explanations on her behalf. They spoke softly, as though shielding her. Yet every word carved away another piece of her dignity. Some said she lacked the charm to entice the king. Others blamed her health or suggested divine disapproval. In the end, her reputation was reshaped like warm wax, molded by hands she could not see and narratives she could not stop. Then came the final cruelty. She was blamed for having no children. The king's refusal to touch her vanished from the story, replaced by accusations of inherent inadequacy. Laws and theologians justified. A queen without heirs was an obstacle to the realm, a failed vessel, sometimes even a threat. The bed she had never been allowed to enter became evidence against her. The most chilling thing was how ordinary it all appeared. No scandal erupted. No public outrage rattled the palace gates. To the court, this was a strategy. To the king, it was convenient. To the queen, it was a slow erosion of identity, an unmaking carried out in perfect silence. The story settles around its cold center. A closed bedchamber could dismantle a woman more effectively than open hostility. A faint rustle in the political air hints at a command that punishes by withholding rather than striking. A shadow waiting just beyond that guarded threshold carries the quiet moment when exile begins before anyone dares to name it. It was never the crown alone that determined a woman's fate in the Tudor court. It was the bed she was led toward, the bed she was expected to conquer or be destroyed by. In a world where alliances were stitched from whispers and torn apart by a single night's opportunity, the marriage bed became the quiet chamber where political executions began long before any axe touched a block. A woman could enter as a newly crowned consort, luminous in expectation, and rise the next morning, already marked for removal by those who studied the smallest shift in the king's favour. The softness of linen only masked the sharpness of the trap beneath it. The truth settled heavily across the court. Some marriages were never meant to unite, only to eliminate. When factions grew too bold, when advisors or noble families pressed too close to power, the king might accept a bride not because she pleased him, but because she weakened someone else. By tying a powerful house to the throne, he could just as easily untie it, unraveling their influence the moment the marriage served its purpose. A wedding feast became a farewell banquet for an entire lineage, though no one dared say it aloud. The bride herself became the instrument of political burial, though she understood nothing of the grave she was standing in. To consummate such a marriage was to seal the arrangement, fix it into law, and give the king the legitimacy he needed to strike. A single night of intimacy, real or staged, could be transformed into a justification for dismantling a faction. Once the marriage was complete, nothing prevented the crown from declaring that its usefulness had ended. Removal could come as dismissal, exile, annulment, or something far quieter, the gradual suffocation of all influence until the woman became a ghost in her own chambers. The marriage bed was never just a bed. It was a ledger, a contract, a blade. This cruelty hid behind the ceremony. Courtiers watched the new bride enter her chamber as musicians faded into silence. They nodded, bowed, offered hollow blessings, knowing that some of these women would be discarded within months. The king's household recorded every detail: who entered the room, how long they stayed, the expressions on their faces when they emerged. These records became weapons, proof that the union had existed, and thus proof that it could be ended. A marriage in the Tudor court was not a bond of affection. It was evidence for future charges. To be a legal wife meant little when the crown no longer required what her body symbolized. Once her political value faded, she was exposed to the cold mechanics of royal strategy. A woman could be cast aside without warning. her jewels stripped, her titles erased, her banners lowered from the palace walls. Courtiers who once knelt before her would turn their gaze to the floor. The king needed no elaborate justification. He had the consummation as his shield. The marriage had been real, therefore, its ending could be declared necessary. The brutality lay in its calculation. A king could remove a rival house by elevating their daughter, only to destroy them by humiliating her. She would be blamed for failing to please him, failing to bear children, failing to charm, failing to justify her presence. The man who had used her as a political hinge would step away untouched, while she withered under accusations crafted to erase any sympathy. A marriage bed had given her power for a moment. The same bed now crushed her. No woman entered these chambers without hearing echoes of those who had walked before her. They knew the thick silence that followed consummation was often more dangerous than the act itself. Once the door closed and the bedding ritual was done, the court began to calculate. Which faction lost? Which faction gained? Who would be punished? Who would suddenly find themselves without protection? With every marriage, the map of influence reshaped itself. And someone, usually the bride, paid the price for that shift. In the Tudor world, nothing rotted as quickly as a consort who had served her purpose. She could still breathe, still speak, still appear at court. Yet she would already be discarded. The king's gaze, drifting elsewhere, was enough to seal her future. Courtiers sensed the change and abandoned her with the same speed they had once praised her. They understood the unspoken rule. Survival depended on recognizing when a marriage had completed its true function. Elimination. The darkness of these unions lingered long after the women themselves were gone. They left behind chambers stripped of tapestries, abandoned beds smelling of cold linen, and courtyards where their footsteps had once been greeted with cheers. Their erasure was swift, deliberate, and complete. The only thing that remained was the quiet knowledge among the court. The marriage bed was as efficient as the scaffold, simply slower and far more silent. The tale tightens into its bitter truth. The marriage bed meant for unity could dismantle life with terrifying ease. One faint shift in courtly favour hints at another bride walking unknowingly toward her undoing. Some shadow waiting behind the chamber door holds the secret of how removal begins long before any warning reaches her. There were nights in the Tudor court when the marriage bed was not a private chamber for two, but a stage arranged for eyes that should never have been there. The couple might stand before the mattress in ceremonial silence, hands trembling, hearts unwilling, while behind a velvet curtain or carved screen, figures waited, quiet, rigid, appointed to witness what should have belonged only to the shadows. The court called them observers of honour, preservers of truth, guardians of legitimacy. But no matter the title, their presence turned the most intimate moment of a woman's life into a political inspection. This intrusion was not optional. When a marriage held dynastic weight, privacy was treated as a luxury the crown could not afford. A barren queen, a disputed heir, an annulment waiting to be justified. These required documentation, so the court stationed witnesses in the room, men or women chosen for loyalty, expected to listen for movement, whispers, the creak of a bed frame. Some were instructed to glimpse the sheets afterward, searching for signs or stains, anything that might later defend or destroy a woman's standing. The bed, once a symbol of union, became a ledger where her worth was measured in evidence she had no freedom to control. For the bride, the humiliation began before the act itself. She knew someone waited behind brocade drapery, hearing the rustle of her gown as she undressed. She knew her body was not entirely her own. It was a subject of scrutiny, a tool for lineage, an object for record. The groom, even if reluctant, had the protection of power, but the bride carried the weight of expectation. She had to prove purity, obedience, and fertility. 3 tests, administered by the quiet breath of strangers, listening just beyond the candlelight. The presence of witnesses was justified as a safeguard against scandal. Yet it seeded scandal more efficiently than it prevented it. If the observers heard too little, suspicions arose. If they heard too much, rumors spread. A single remark could be twisted into mockery. A single silence transformed into accusation. And once the story left the chamber, it no longer belonged to the couple, it belonged to the court, where gossip was as lethal as the axe. There were nights when the observers themselves became instruments of politics. A faction might plant one of their own as a witness, ensuring that the report matched their ambitions. A sympathetic observer could protect a bride by confirming what had not happened. A hostile one could destroy her by claiming what never occurred. Truth mattered less than the version most useful to those who held influence. The bride, exposed in body and reputation. I had no defense except the mercy of people who hid behind curtains. Even when the act was completed without interruption, the ordeal was far from over. The bedding was examined, catalogued, and sometimes even preserved as legal evidence. Linen was folded with care, stored with notes, and prepared to be retrieved in case of future dispute. It was a ritual suffocating in its coldness, the most intimate moment of 2 human beings transformed into an artifact for lawyers and counselors. A woman could not protest. Her silence was the final requirement, sealing the chamber like a tomb. Courtiers pretended this was tradition, necessity, or protection of the crown. But beneath the ceremony lay a profound cruelty. A woman's vulnerability was displayed, weaponized, and archived. If she later sought annulment, the bedding worked against her. If she wished to assert legitimacy, the bedding could be denied or twisted. The king could use it as proof to free himself from her. His advisors could use it to bind her to a fate she never chose. In every direction, the linen closed around her like the tightening walls of a trap. Nor did the presence of witnesses guarantee fairness. There were cases in which the bedding evidence was forged, stained artificially, or replaced entirely. A bride's future could hinge on a piece of cloth she never touched. The whispered testimony of a hidden observer could outweigh her truth. The court rarely cared whether she spoke. It didn't care whether she served the narrative required by those above her. Yet the strangest cruelty lay in how ordinary the practice became. Courtiers discussed the placements of witnesses as if arranging seating for a banquet. Servants prepared the chamber like a stage set. The couple performed their roles, knowing that the quiet shift behind the curtain meant their lives were not unfolding in private, but under silent surveillance. This was the Tudor world, where a marriage bed was not a refuge but documentation, where intimacy became law, and where a woman's deepest vulnerability could be archived for future legal battle. It is unsettling to imagine the candlelight flickering across the bed, while unseen eyes waited just beyond the drapery. It is more unsettling to know that those eyes could decide her future, with a single sentence whispered to the council the next morning. What was meant to unite 2 bodies instead bound the bride to a fate she did not shape. The tale settles around its cold truth. Supervision in the marriage chamber could carve a woman's destiny more sharply than any decree. Whispered movements hint at another bed, prepared not for love but for judgment. A quiet watcher, hidden behind the curtains, holds the moment that will ignite the next. Darker unravelling. In the Tudor court, the end of a marriage did not begin with arguments, petitions, or whispered accusations. It began with the same bed that had once bound the couple together. Every annulment, every dismissal, every quiet unthreading of a queen's fate circled back to the chamber where 2 bodies were expected to confirm a union. The law might have spoken in formal terms, but the court understood the truth. The marriage bed was the first witness, the final judge, and often the executioner of a woman's future. If no consummation occurred, the path to separation opened easily, almost eagerly. An unfulfilled marriage was treated as a hollow structure, lacking the one act that could anchor it to legitimacy. Courtiers spoke of such unions with clinical detachment, as though the absence of intimacy proved the absence of value. For the king, it offered an escape without disgrace. For the bride, it meant her worth collapsed instantly, as though her inability to complete the ritual stripped her of identity. The court accepted this logic without hesitation. It was efficient, cold, and convenient. But consummation transformed the terrain into something far more treacherous. Once the act had been acknowledged, through testimony, linen, or rumor, the marriage gained a solidity that could not be undone without invoking fault. The law demanded a cause, a failure, a flaw so grave that the crown could declare the union broken. This meant the woman's body became evidence against her. Her fertility, her virtue, her conduct, even her silence, could be twisted into grounds for removal. The burden rested almost entirely on her shoulders, while the king remained shielded behind authority. The marriage bed thus became a battlefield disguised as a piece of furniture. What occurred there, whether truthfully, partially, or through fabricated witness, determined whether a woman would be dismissed quietly, humiliated publicly, or destroyed entirely. Servants whispered about queens who prayed the king would not approach their chamber, and others who prayed he would, because either choice could decide their survival. A single night could protect them, trap them, condemn them, or free them. The cruelty lay in how little control they had over the outcome. Once a marriage neared its breaking point, the court mined the past for proof. Counselors hunted for inconsistencies in the bride's behavior, discrepancies in statements, or rumors of misconduct. They interrogated witnesses, reviewed bedding records, and interrogated servants who had passed by the chamber door. Everything returned to that single question: did the bed serve its political function? And if so, who should bear the consequences now that the union was no longer useful? Even the language of annulment was sharpened to wound. Words like invalid, unconsummated, or deficient clung to the woman's name, spreading through court corridors like a stain. To be declared unconsummated implied she had failed in her duty. To be declared consummated meant the king needed a different justification, often more brutal. In both cases, she was the one burdened with the shame. The court excelled at twisting intimacy into indictment. There were cases in which consummation had occurred, but was denied by those who sought political gain. The witnesses who once guaranteed legitimacy could suddenly disappear, their testimony forgotten or recast. Linen that had once proved union could be dismissed as inconclusive or stolen outright. Truth mattered far less than the narrative the king needed to justify his desires. A woman could swear that the marriage had been fulfilled, yet her voice meant nothing without evidence preserved by hands that did not wish to protect her. Meanwhile, the king could invoke impotence, incompatibility, or divine displeasure as explanations for ending a union. These claims required minimal proof. The court always found a way to mold the story around his needs. The woman, lacking such luxury, you could only watch her life disintegrate through claims rooted in the very bed where she had once been ordered to prove loyalty, obedience, and purity. This relentless emphasis on consummation turned private acts into public tools. A couple's most intimate moment became a legal hinge, swinging open or shut according to political necessity. Queens learned that their futures depended not on their character or contributions, but on how the court interpreted one night. Sometimes real, sometimes invented, always decisive. It was an impossible burden, a silent weight pressing on their every breath. The bed, therefore, came to represent the paradox of Tudor marriage. The same act demanded for legitimacy could also serve as grounds for destruction. Women were bound by rules they could not escape. Men were freed by loopholes they did not hesitate to use. The door to the marriage chamber was never truly closed, for the court's eyes reached through its cracks, waiting to turn its secrets into strategy. The tale settles into its cold truth. The same act, meant to unite two lives, could be twisted into the blade that ends one. Whispered recollections hint at chambers where evidence waits like a loaded trap. One faint stir in the political air signals that judgment is already forming long before the next curtain is drawn. Silence in the Tudor court was never gentle. It was sharp, weighted, coiled like a predator waiting beneath a bed of silk. The morning after a royal wedding did not bring peace, but the opening move of a campaign fought without steel or banners. 3 groups, wife, mistress, and counsellor, began circling one another in the invisible arena built around the king's chamber. Nothing was declared aloud, yet the war had already started. Each woman knew that the bed she had not slept in, or hoped to sleep in, would decide her survival. The queen, still aching from ritual and expectation, understood immediately that her place was not secured by the wedding. It was secured by being chosen again, and again, and again. A single night meant nothing in a world where affection was currency and routine could turn into ruin. She walked through the palace halls with slow composure, but her pulse counted every glance, every whisper, every shift in the king's expression. She was no longer merely a bride, she was a participant in continuous negotiation. To her body, the ground on which alliances would rise or fall, the king's mistress, if one existed, did not retreat simply because vows had been spoken. She watched the queen with narrowed eyes, calculating distance like a soldier reading a battlefield. Her power had never come from ceremony. It came from access. Access to the king's laughter, his exhaustion, his weakness, his bed when he wished for comfort instead of obligation. She knew the queen could threaten that access, but she also knew the queen had no guarantee of anything. The mistress fought with familiarity, with secrets, with the history of knights the queen could not erase. Counsellors, men whose loyalty bent toward opportunity, hovered at the edges of these tensions. They studied the king's fatigue after a visit to one chamber or another. They noted who sat beside him at supper, who received a small smile in a corridor, and who stood at a greater distance than before. These men understood that the politics of the bedchamber shaped treaties, of patronage, land, and law. They whispered to their factions, "She is gaining favour," or "He grows restless," or "The queen is too quiet today," perhaps a sign of weakness. Each interpretation became ammunition, each misstep a wound. Every night, the king chose a chamber, and the palace shifted its breath. Servants carried candles along a particular corridor, and the walls themselves seemed to lean in, listening. The queen waited in her room, knowing that footsteps might come, or might not. The mistress waited elsewhere, equally tense. Whomever the king approached gained an advantage that could not be recorded in law, but was felt instantly at court. One night could fortify a family. One night could destroy a rival. One night could tilt the entire balance of power. In this environment, the smallest gesture carried fatal weight. A brush of the king's hand against a woman's sleeve during a feast. A whisper was exchanged too quietly. A sigh escaped his lips when a particular name was mentioned. Courtiers interpreted these moments with obsessive precision, each seeking to align themselves with the rising influence. The queen learned to move without revealing longing or fear. The mistress learned to smile without appearing triumphant. The counsellors learned to remain neutral while sharpening their knives. It was the intimacy of warfare that made it most brutal. A queen could not attack her rival openly. That would mark her as unfit, desperate, or jealous. Instead, she used silence, posture, and patience. She learned which ladies-in-waiting reported to which factions. She learned that a misplaced word could travel across the court and return sharpened against her. She slept lightly, knowing that rumours could be planted while she rested. Her greatest weapon was endurance, yet endurance could wither if the king ignored her chamber long enough. The mistress faced her own dangers. If she overreached, she became a threat to the stability of the marriage. If she retreated, she risked fading from the king's attention. She balanced on a blade's edge, offering comfort but never demanding, offering companionship without appearing hungry for power. Yet everyone knew she was fighting for her life, just as fiercely as the queen fought for hers. A single night could elevate her. A single whispered complaint could destroy her. And behind them, the councillors plotted. To them, the rivalry between wife and mistress was a resource. They channeled it, fed it, weaponized it. A queen favoured by the king might advance the fortunes of her family. A mistress favoured by the king might advance the fortunes of individual courtiers. No one remained neutral. Even silence was partisan. Small gestures became decisive blows. A gentle touch on the king's shoulder. A single breath against his ear. A glance too warm or too cold. These seemed trivial. Yet, in the Tudor world, such moments could unmake a queen or crown an unexpected rival. The marriage bed was not the end of the contest. It was the opening gate. The tale rests upon its harsh truth. Whispers could strike deeper than any blade in the Tudor court. One faint rustle of silk suggests shifting favour in chambers the court fears to speak of. One quiet breath in the dark hints at the first ripple of a rivalry that will not remain hidden for long. History remembers thrones because thrones are visible. They gleam beneath candlelight, dazzle diplomats, anchor coronations, and stand immovable in portraits of kings who wish to be remembered as monuments. But the quiet machinery of Tudor power never resided in carved oak or gilded wood. It lived in a chamber where the air was softer and far more dangerous. The true centre of influence lay stretched beneath embroidered blankets, guarded not by soldiers but by secrets. The bed, simple, silent, and steady, was the hinge on which women's destinies swung, often without warning, often without mercy. For Tudor women, the bed was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield they did not choose, a weapon they could not refuse, a stage from which they could rise or vanish. They entered the palace with gowns carefully sewn and names carefully spoken. Yet all their preparation narrowed into a single expectation. They must survive whatever unfolded once the chamber door closed. They had no swords, no armies, no councils. They had only themselves, the king's shifting appetite, and the cruel awareness that affection could evaporate faster than candle smoke. Every woman in the Tudor world understood this, even if she spoke of it only in silence. She knew that a soft mattress could decide which child inherited lands, which family ascended in rank, which faction toppled at court, which whisper turned into accusation. The hierarchy of power, so proudly displayed in public, dissolved entirely in the dark. In that darkness, a queen's crown weighed nothing compared to the weight of the king's attention. A mistress with the right timing could eclipse an entire dynasty. A neglected wife could watch her lineage crumble because the king chose another chamber for the night. This truth carved sorrow into many lives. Some women believed they could shape their own path, only to find themselves undone by a single evening of displeasure. Others learned to navigate the danger more slowly, offering silence when silence protected, offering softness when softness bought time. But even the cleverest woman could not guard against the whims of power. A king might turn cold without explanation. A counsellor might whisper poison into his ear. A rival might slip into his chamber with tears. Stories, promises, whatever would shift the balance. And still, these women endured. They learned to read subtle signs, the tension in the king's shoulders, the distance in his voice, the sharpness of his breath at supper. They noticed which servants kept their eyes lowered and which lingered too long. They sensed when the court held its breath, waiting for a sign that favour had tilted. Their lives became a study of prediction, a quiet intelligence service built from intuition and dread. What made their struggle more haunting was its invisibility. The great conflicts of the Tudor era, wars, treaties, and rebellions, were chronicled by men who held pens and titles. But the conflicts that determined the private fates of queens remained unrecorded, surviving only in fragile hints, a letter softened by grief, a rumour sharpened by ambition, a diary entry where ink trembled with fear. Behind every political shift lay a chamber moment no historian fully saw. Some women triumphed. For a time, they learned how to hold the king's gaze, how to soothe his wounds, how to navigate the factions pressing against them. They built alliances, stood their ground, and used the bed as a negotiation table when no other table accepted their presence. But victory in such a place was always temporary. What elevated them one season could destroy them the next. And when downfall came, it arrived with quiet cruelty. A cancelled visit, a closed door, a cold announcement spoken by a messenger who dared not meet their eyes. Others met endings far more brutal. They walked into the bedchamber as queens and walked out as condemned women. A whisper could turn into a charge could turn into a trial, and a trial, once begun, rarely ended in mercy. Many women lost crowns, some lost freedom, a few lost their lives. Their last thoughts echoing the same question: how could everything unravel so quickly in the place meant to hold love? Because love had little to do with it. The Tudor bed was a political instrument. It registered loyalties. It exposed betrayals. It produced heirs and eliminated rivals. It rewarded patience and punished miscalculation. Whether a woman lay upon it in fear, resolve, or resignation, the bed recorded her fate in silence. Perhaps the most heartbreaking truth is this: not all victories drew blood, but many drew tears. Quiet tears shed into pillows embroidered for royalty. Tears that would fade before morning, leaving only faint marks no historian could ever trace. The palace corridors remembered footsteps, not sorrow. The throne preserved triumph, not sacrifice. But the bed, impartial and indifferent, held the imprint of every woman who fought a war no one acknowledged. And yet, even in this bleak world, women found ways to protect themselves. They forged alliances in whispers, hid fragments of their souls where politics could not reach, and taught their daughters what to fear and what to withhold. They refused to be erased, even when discarded. They left behind shadows that unsettled courts long after their bodies were buried. The Tudor palace glittered with power, but its glimmer masked the quiet tragedies unfolding behind curtains. Those curtains muffled cries, concealed negotiations, and witnessed betrayals. They were silent archivists of a history written not in ink, but in breath, in trembling hands, in the soft collapse of hope. Behind them, women learned that the throne was never the true seat of power. The bed was, and in that revelation lies the chilling reminder that intimacy, in the wrong hands, becomes a tool sharper than any blade. Kings ruled kingdoms, but beds ruled kings, and the women forced to live under that truth carried its weight until their final day. Now, as the palace grows quiet and the candles shrink into their pools of wax, the story folds gently into darkness. The chamber door closes once more, and the echoes of all those battles, fought with whispers instead of swords, settle into the shadows. Good night, dear listener. May your own bed be free of schemes, free of sorrow, free of the unseen wars that shaped so many forgotten queens. Rest softly, rest safely, and may sleep take you gently, far from the silent cruelties that once ruled the Tudor night.